Welcome back to 50 Days to Rebuild, the series where I do 50 minutes of exercise and read 50 pages of a physio book in an attempt to rehab myself. This is day 19. Jumping into the exercise portion for today, I think really the overarching message here was around patience. I was really keen to sort of have things progress given some of the feelings in the previous days of feeling like things were getting a bit better. But looking at, say, the bird dog to start with here, I did notice, I was thinking, oh, I'm going to start progressing, tomorrow maybe. But I was noticing, hey, my hips are still trying to rock, and I had to really, really focus. And I'm only doing one limb at a time right now. So the fact I'm having to focus that hard when I'm doing one leg, I probably shouldn't be going back to both limbs simultaneously yet. And I will add, I'm still having some trouble with the shoulder portion. And if that's really not feeling great, again, I shouldn't be jumping yet. The other big thing here that I did with all my exercises was I tried to sort of temper down that contraction in my abs, that whole brace. Just following on from what I learned yesterday about 25% being the maximum needed essentially for most plyometric stuff. And I'm having it for everything higher than that. So tried to bring it down a bit. That was rather confusing, but it felt alright in the bird dog. In the side plank, it felt like I wasn't activating one side of my abs. I think the one good thing about this was it made me realize that maybe my heavy contraction is to some extent a compensatory mechanism where it's sort of hiding some bad form. So I noticed I wasn't really locking my rib cage down to my pelvis. So once I did that, I got a better activation on the side that wasn't sort of facing the ground, and I was still able to sort of reduce the intensity of the contraction but still have something there, which was good. With the bridge, again, still difficulties to start, but eventually got it. It did take a bit longer than normal. Really felt like I was either A, losing neutral, or B, sort of overemphasizing the extension in my knees, but when I wasn't, I was sort of losing it. So it was a bit hard, but eventually did feel like I was getting the sensation I wanted. But I think the fact it wasn't perfect, and I was getting some level of SI joint pain prior to it, unfortunately, which again might play into the fact I'm not doing a full bird dog. It was actually quite hard to get the glute squeezed the whole time. And I don't know again if this is meaning that I should maybe come back to a hip flexor massage, because that's what I did previously to help. But it was okay today, but it might be an indication that we're starting to sort of progressively get worse in it, and we might need to re-loosen things up. Okay, in terms of what I learned today, I actually jumped between two books. I was going to just read the one, which is the one that I had started yesterday I said I'd talk about, which is Proprioceptive Neuromuscular Facilitation. This is written by two of the three original people that made PNF, but it gets to a point in the book where it kind of just goes through all the different movements, which is cool. It'd be a great reference text, but I didn't really need to read any of it. It was just sort of stating the same fundamentals and principles just for each exercise. And I wasn't really able to do it. It required another practitioner to help. So did start reading this other one called Facilitated Stretching. This one's a much easier read, I must add. The first one felt, to be honest, kind of hellish to read. I'm not saying the info's not good, but it was really hard to get through. This other one's definitely made for more of a lay reader. Okay, so I'm going to try and wrap my head and combine some of the things from these books to really figure out what's happening in PNF. My understanding is this is around the time when reciprocal inhibition was noted, that if you activate one side of a joint, the other side will relax. Right, so if I squeeze the quads, the hamstrings are going to relax and lengthen. That sort of seems to be the main fundamental thing happening here. The other key principle seems to be that they believe that motion takes place in diagonal and spiral lines. This was quite interesting to see after reading anatomy trains. It doesn't make that argument completely in anatomy trains, but it definitely has an overlap. And reading that, it's hard for me to accept the idea that all motion occurs in those planes, but I can see how it might be a more functional approach, that we're having sort of multi-planar movement. But yeah, that's sort of the arguments that they're making. It's essentially built on this idea that we're going to move along these diagonal lines, isometrically contract, and then relax to gain more range of motion. There was reference to one technique which was following along from the same thing but then ending in an isotonic movement, so squeezing the antagonist to get more movement. But then they sort of countered that and said that it looks like with more modern research they basically just need isometric contraction. The original creators, however, listed out a plethora of different techniques. For example, they covered rhythmic stabilization. So this one, I guess, might be more akin to the other approach. It was isometric fully, so it was getting the antagonist to activate. So say I was pushing on my arm and saying, keep that still, like fight against my resistance, and then pulling on it from the other side and saying, keep it still, fight my resistance. So going antagonist to agonist and back. And they said that could help sort of correct the balance between the antagonist and agonist. Then there was the slow reversal hold relax. This one said that we want to either isotonically or isometrically engage the agonist, then isotonically engage the antagonist, and then isotonically engage the agonist repeatedly. There was so much little variations between like a plethora of different techniques. They said that worked better in certain scenarios, like if people had more weakness or were more neurally inhibited. From what I can tell from my reading here, it's like this was essentially made for people with polio or like around that time. I could see why it could be useful in that sense. What technique is correct here, I'm really not sure. Also, one of the other fundamental principles here that the original authors talk about was around irradiation. And this seemed to flow into a lot of what McGill talks about, how having like a lot of maximal tension in other sort of distal areas can sort of contribute to that neuronal overflow. This is also similar to what Pavel Sassaline would say. So that seemed interesting. They were really saying you need a maximal contraction to really get the relaxation to happen, whereas the more modern authors were arguing we just need like a good contraction. We don't need like an absolutely maximal one to sort of trigger this relaxation of the muscle. Again, what's correct? No idea, but yeah, I guess sort of some different ideas proposed. Beyond that, the original authors did have a bunch of different techniques that honestly were quite hard to follow around reinforcement and around which joint should be prioritized as to like which one you should resist. Admittedly, in their examples of how to go through each technique, like for each posture, it looks like they cover that a bit better about like where you should apply resistance, if it's like the proximal joint you're trying to strengthen versus the distal or middle joint. From a principle perspective, it was quite difficult to understand, but in the examples it was alright. I think I'll probably, if I try any of this, try and lean towards more of the newer stuff, just because it's a bit simpler. But look, if I have any difficulties, certainly coming back to these more original authors and just seeing if any of those techniques work, I can't imagine will hurt. I'm also really interested to see if this ties into Shirley Saruman's work. I have some of her books and I've never read them. They're very case study heavy. But I know that she worked around, people with polio, so maybe this is a similar approach. So I might give some of that a go. I will say it looks like some of this is definitely conflicting with like more of the McGill approach of like a neutral spine. Like these guys are recommending before, stretching before exercising, at least in the newer text. Not exactly what he would be a proponent of. Seeing some of the stretches, they look very spine flexy, spine bendy, unhealthy for the spine, one might say. Yeah, I think I'm going to try and steal some of the principles, but also keep that neutral spine when I apply things. And that about wraps it up for day 19. I have zero idea what I'm going to read next. I burned through most of the content from these books because it's starting to get into more specific stretches that might be a bit hard to cover. And they, again, like I said, they might be a bit repetitive. But we'll see. Might do Shirley's work next. Thanks for listening and have a good one. Cheers.